Hi, World History. Welcome to U15-L7, Basics of World War II, Part 3. So this is the last of the Ed puzzles that I do. Learning targets. Examine conflicting narratives about the past and identify how these narratives can lead to global conflict. Your job, you're going to watch this Ed puzzle. Any questions that are going to be in blue text are going to be questions I want you to answer directly on the Ed puzzle. And if you have any questions, let us teachers know. We are here to help you. All right, so we talked about Japan the last 2 times. Now let's switch our focus back to Europe a little bit. All right, so June of 1940, France falls to Germany. So German forces break through the Maginot Line, which was a concrete wall that France had built in order to keep Germany out of crossing the border. Germany simply goes around the Maginot Line via Belgium, and I'll show you a map right here. So the Maginot Line was fortified right here, and then it had kind of more weaker fortifications here. Of course, France did it all along the border of Germany, but Germany had the brilliant idea of, hey, why don't we simply just go around the fortification? We'll just literally go through Belgium and into France, where the wall is kind of weak. And that's exactly what Germany did. All right, so Germany had control of France. French General Charles de Gaulle, who's this guy right here, he flees to London. He sets up a radio show broadcasting from England. England and France are only 40 miles apart at their closest. He tells the French people to resist the Nazis on radio, which of course is great for him because he is in the kind of sort of safety of London. So since France fell, Great Britain had to fight Germany alone. During this time, Winston Churchill, who's this dude right here, became the new prime minister. And he declared that Great Britain would never surrender against Germany. He said, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall never surrender." All right, one of the more famous battles of the European theater is the Battle of Britain, which happened in July and August of 1940. So like I said before, Great Britain was the main fighting force against the Axis, because remember, the U.S. does not join the war until 1941 after Pearl Harbor. Here's a map, by the way, of the English Channel. Right here is the closest part that France and England are together. It's only about 40 miles between the English Channel. So Germany wanted to overwhelm Britain. Germany's strategy was to first establish air superiority and then send in ground forces. But Britain actually withstood the German attacks, and that is due to the Royal Air Force, or the RAF. Because the RAF had developed a radar system that helped prepare when and where airplanes and ships were, so they could see the Germans coming and shoot them down or stop them before they actually got to the British mainland. The London Blitz happened in September of 1940. That's where Germany bombed London daily. They dropped a total of 35,000 tons of bombs. Here's a photo of some of the aftermath. Of course, you can see this building is just absolutely destroyed. This bus was flipped over on its side. Windows are just absolutely shattered. Germans attack other Great Britain cities as well, not just London. But this also allowed the RAF time to rebuild radars and forces. And then in retaliation, Great Britain would bomb Berlin to strike fear in the German people as well. So here's some aftermath as well of the bombing. You can just see, streets after streets are just turned into pure rubble. So the London Blitz was considered the first all-air battle in World War II. It ended at the end of September with Great Britain winning that air battle due to the radar. This is a picture of people who would sleep in the subways, because of course the subways are underground, so that would be fairly safe from the bombs. But if you can imagine, just hundreds, if not thousands of people just sleeping on the railroad tracks. So there are 3 reasons for the Great Britain victory. The first one was the development of the radar, the skill of the RAF, or the Royal Air Force, and also the British government imposed a total blackout. So why would a blackout help? Here's kind of a picture to help you out with that question. Yeah, blackout would help, right? Because you're covering up like your curtains, you're turning off all the lights. So it would be really hard for German planes up in the sky to see where their targets are. So that's why it was so successful. All right, now on to America. So the US tried to stay neutral during the war, like we talked about before Pearl Harbor. FDR uses the policy of isolationism. Remind me, what is isolationism again, if you remember? That is when a country isolates itself from other countries' affairs, especially in wartime. The US passes a neutrality acts, meaning that they're not going to send any arms to warring nations and they're not going to loan any money to warring nations. Then there was the Lend-Lease Act of May of 1941. The US saw its friend Great Britain really struggling in the war, especially after France got taken over. So the Lend-Lease Act reverses some of the Neutrality Act. So the US can now provide military aid to Great Britain, and it indicates that the US has now sided with Great Britain during World War II. Secretly, as well, President Roosevelt and Churchill were meeting, and they created something called the Atlantic Charter together. Remember, this is all pre-Pearl Harbor at this point. So the Atlantic Charter is declaring support of 1, free trade among nations, and 2, the right of citizens to choose their own type of government. Now, let's switch to Germany versus Russia. Again, if you hear me say Russia or the USSR or the Soviet Union, it means the same thing. So Germany attacks Russia in June of 1941. Prior to this, Hitler had taken over Yugoslavia and Greece. So now Hitler is invading Russia and breaks the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact that we talked about, what was that, like 5 or so lessons ago? They had the operation of Barbarossa, which is where Hitler wanted to eliminate communism and then eliminate any Jews in Russia as well. Germany deploys the Einsatzgruppen in Russia, which are literally these soldiers who are mobile killing units. They are SS officers who would go into towns and kill Jewish people. They just walk in, line these people up, and shoot them. Germany did push the Soviet army back all the way to Moscow. 2 million Russians were prisoners of war, but the tides were turning for the Russians. They were going to start winning once winter set in. So, note to self, never invade Russia in the winter. Germans had no winter clothes, they had a lack of food, and that year it was horrible winter conditions in Russia, where the Russian people were actually prepared for the cold. So Germans were actually forced to turn back in December 1941. This also cost 730,000 German casualties. And a casualty, by the way, is when someone is either dead or hurt. So this number here includes soldiers who are dead or soldiers that are like very much so injured. All right, so let's switch back to the United States real quick. So tell me again, what else happened in December of 1941? We talked about it not too long ago. That's right, Pearl Harbor. So the U.S. enters World War II. So the Allied powers, we have US, we have Russia, we have Great Britain. We also have France, but they kind of gotten taken over by Germany in 1940, so they're kind of useless at this point. There are other countries included with the Allied powers that don't really get talked about. They include Australia, Belgium, Canada, China, Costa Rica, Cuba, Czechoslovakia, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Greece, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, India, Luxembourg, Netherlands, New Zealand, Nicaragua, Norway, Panama, Poland, South Africa, and Yugoslavia. So there was more to the Allied powers than just like the 4 that we talk about, but, I guess we just don't ever talk about them. All right, so the Allied powers, their goal was to fight until the Axis surrenders. And they also had a goal to fight in Africa as well. So I know we talk a lot about like the Pacific or the Japanese side of the war. We talk about the European side of war, but there's also a third front of the war that does not get talked about very much, and that is the North African side. One of the more famous African battles was the Battle of El Alamein in Egypt, which was located right here. Germany and Italy wanted to take control of North Africa, and then Britain and the US stops them in May of 1943. You will be watching a video in a couple of lessons about World War II North Africa, by the way. That'll go into a little bit more details. I don't know much about what happened in North Africa during World War II, so that's why we'll watch a History Channel video about it. All right, then we also have the Battle of Stalingrad. So Stalingrad is over here kind of in the Eurasia section of the continent. This happened in August 1942 until February of 1943. Germany attacked Stalingrad, Russia, which is located right here. Russia stopped the German advancement on the Eastern Front, and this really is considered the turning point of the Eastern Front. I know we talked about last lesson about like the turning front on the Pacific side or the Japanese side. This is really the turning front on the European side of World War II. All right, so the Tehran Conference. This happened in November of 1943. That is where Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill met at Tehran, Iran, and they discussed the end of the war and the final assault on Germany. This is also the meeting that they thought of the D-Day invasions. So D-Day, probably one of the most famous aspects of World War II, happened on June 6, 1944. That is where the Allies invaded Nazi France. It was led by this dude right here, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who would go on to become a U.S. president. More than 1 million men landed on the beaches of France, Normandy being the main beach, but there were multiple other beaches. So here's kind of, let's see here, a map that shows how this operated. So the Allied soldiers came from England, and they landed right here, which has more of a zoomed in map right here. And then they would then work their way up towards the rest of France, taking back Paris, and then pushing all the way into Germany. If you watch Saving Private Ryan, by the way, D-Day that's like the big famous scene at the beginning. That's all about D-Day. All right, so during D-Day, there were underwater mines, there were barbed wire, there were machine guns. There's about 10,000 Allied casualties. So here's a picture of what that looks like. And here's again more of that zoomed in map there. Here's another photo of the soldiers getting off of the boats. Now, some of these were the lucky ones getting off the boats because they weren't actually, like these guys were fairly safe versus where some of the Allied forces landed. There were so many German machine guns firing upon them that when these little hatches opened up, everyone on that boat was pretty much killed within seconds. Here's another image. Here's another one. All right, so 3 months after D-Day, Allies have over 2 million men in France. They break through the German lines, they take back Paris on August 25th in 1944, and the Allies keep pushing past France and now into Germany. This leads to the Battle of the Bulge, which is also one of the more famous battles of World War II. So here's kind of the long story short. It is the Allies versus Germany in December of 1944 until January of 1945. It is Germany's last stand. Germany knows at this point, like, they either have to win this battle or they're done for. So in Belgium and Luxembourg was where this was located, kind of right on the border of Germany. I'll show you on a map in just a second. The Allies end up winning this battle, and they now start entering into Germany. So here's a map of the Battle of the Bulge. As you can see here, it's called that because it's kind of like a bulge of German line kind of sticking out like a peninsula right here. So American forces and other Allied forces kind of like surrounded this bulge, defeated them, and now they're pushing actually into Germany's border. So the ending of World War II. The Soviets retook the land from Germany, and Soviets entered Berlin in April of 1945. Here's a picture of a Soviet soldier in the middle of Berlin. As you can see, it's been also bombed quite heavily, as there's literally just debris, and that roof looks like it needs some help, with the Soviet flag hanging over the ledge. In January of 1945, Hitler starts to hide underground. In April 28th of 1945, Mussolini is dead by firing squad. And then April 30th of 1945, Hitler commits suicide. So here's some inside pictures of what Hitler's bunk looks like. Here's a model of what Hitler's bunker looked like as well. So you can see there's lots of little rooms. So on May 7th, 1945, Germany surrenders. This is known as the VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. The war in Germany is over, but the war in Asia still continues. All right, so we wrapped up what kind of the end of the Asia war looked like with the atomic bomb and stuff like that in the last lesson. So that's kind of the ending of World War II. What was the cost of World War II, though? 21 million soldiers are dead. 40 million civilians are dead. 28 million of those civilians were either Russian or Chinese. Displaced people. 30 million people in Europe are now displaced, meaning they don't have a home to go back to. They don't really have a country to go back to. Germans are expelled from the Sudetenland. If you remember, we talked about that at the very first slideshow. And Poland gets back its German land that Germany stole. The war cost about $4 trillion total. The economies of the world are kind of back into oppression because the economy was really built on the war, of making war supplies. All of a sudden the war is done. There's not really a need for a lot of manufacturers or anything anymore. So that's where a lot of manufacturers that manufactured bombs and guns and tanks and boats for the war now switch to more consumer goods, such as KitchenAid mixers. So Britain and France both want to keep their colonies. If you remember, their colonies were Britain had one in India. We talked about the India colonies. And then we also talked about South Africa. France had French Indochina. And they end up actually giving up those colonies, and those colonies gain independence. The reason for this is because Great Britain no longer had the wealth or the military to maintain these colonies anymore. Then we have the Yalta Conference. So this was where the leaders met in the city of Yalta, Russia in February of 1945, so just right before the ending of the war. Stalin, FDR, and Churchill are there. Stalin wanted a buffer zone between Russia and Germany, so Germany couldn't attack Russia ever again. And FDR wants self-determination, meaning that former colonies would vote to see how they want their government set up. All three of these guys agreed to allow former colonies to hold elections determining their political system. Remember, the U.S. is very democratic. Russia is very communist. Russia doesn't want colonies to go democratic, and the U.S. doesn't want colonies to go communist. And there was also the creation of what is called the United Nations, which is still around today. They also agreed that the Axis needed to surrender unconditionally. So in the Yalta Conference, it created 4 zones in Germany of how Germany was going to be split up among the 4 allies. So as you can see here, this would be ruled by Great Britain. This chunk would be ruled by Russia. The US would have this chunk down here, and France gets the smaller chunk. But, it's by France, so it kind of makes sense. In July of 1945 was the Potsdam Conference. This is again where US, Great Britain, and Russia meet once again. The only change is that FDR is dead, so Vice President Truman, who is now the president, takes over. It is held in Potsdam, Germany, which is located right here. Truman knows that the US has the ultimate weapon, which is the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb would then later drop in August on Japan. Truman demands free elections throughout Eastern Europe. Stalin really hates this because free elections mean no communist spread. And all agree that Japan has to leave its territories that it conquered in China and other parts of Asia. And all three agree upon the Nuremberg trials. So again, here's a map of Japan and all of the land that Japan had laid claim to during World War II. So the Nuremberg trials. Those were from 1945 until 1949, held in Nuremberg, Germany. Nazis and other Axis powers were put on trial for war crimes for the World War II and the Holocaust. 22 major war criminals were tried. 12 were convicted and sentenced to death. 3 were convicted and sent to prison, and 4 were convicted to non-life in prison. So this trial shows that national leaders can be held responsible for war crimes against humanity. All right, let's talk about post-war Japan. So after the atomic bomb drops in August of 1945, Japan surrenders. On August 14th, Japan officially surrenders, called VJ Day, or Victory in Japan Day. U.S. military occupies Japan. The U.S. government appoints Douglas MacArthur, who's this dude right here, to control Japan's government. Douglas MacArthur began demilitarization, which is disbanding the Japanese military. This is to stop the threat of war ever happening again, and to this day, Japan is still not allowed a military. They have something called the Japanese Self-Defense Force, which is kind of like a National Guard, kind of, sort of, but it is not considered like a real full military. So, like I said, yep, today Japan has a self-defense force, like a military, but it's really not called a military. There's about 247,000 members of the JSDF today. And it's also the reason why the U.S. has 23 military bases in Japan today. So here is a map of all of the military bases that are currently in Japan. There's a lot. So under MacArthur, Japan was to go through democratization. Ooh, that's a hard word. So that means that Japan had to create a new government and a constitution. So a bunch of Japanese citizens gathered together, and they created actually a constitutional monarchy. So a constitutional monarchy is just like Great Britain's constitutional monarchy. So there's an emperor, or in the case of Great Britain, there's a king, but we're talking about Japan. So there's an emperor. He's the figurehead. And elected officials and the prime minister have all the government power. So pretty much like the emperor or like the king, they're just there for show. They really don't have any political power. Japan was occupied under U.S. rule until 1952 and still is an extent today with the U.S. military bases. So if you ever go to like an antique shop or maybe like a elderly relative's home or something like that, take a look underneath some of like the pottery or other kind of knickknack stuff. You may just see this symbol on the bottom. It says Made in Occupied Japan. So that means that it was manufactured while the U.S. was ruling over Japan. All right, let's wrap this up. Today we learned about Charles de Gaulle, Winston Churchill, Battle of Britain, Atlantic Charter, Battle of Stalingrad, D-Day, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Battle of the Bulge, Nuremberg trials, demilitarization, democratization. All right, next up, you're going to do the Holocaust and today, and then U15-L9, World War II, North Africa, then U15-L10, World War II video choice. Just choose 2 of the 4 videos to watch. Then we're going to get started on the movie that you all chose, which will be U15-L11, L12, L13, and L14, Life is Beautiful. Then U15-L15, the Pink Triangle Primary Source Reading. And U15-L16, the directions for the Unit 15 summative. And then once you're done watching those directions, you will do the Unit 15 summative. Wrap up. All right, if you have any questions, comments, or want to learn more, please email your teacher. We are happy to help you out. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.